I'm Rachael here with Rich Schmidt, and we're here with the A to Z team located here at Rachael. And in order, left to right, we have Bill and Deborah Hatcher, and then we have Sam Tannahill and Cheryl Francis. And our first question for you guys is, why wine?
Like I said earlier, I wasn't paying attention on career day.
For me, it was more about Oregon than about wine. We were here only one day. I tasted Oregon Pinot Noir across the street. It wasn't Cheryl then, it was Veritas, and it was love at first taste. We met some people that very night, went back to St. Louis, sold our stuff, sold our house, a 3-story, 100-year-old home that we'd just refurbished, sold what we could from inside of it, put the rest in the storage, sold 2 cars, gave a car to my brother, bought a little used Volvo station wagon, put the German Shepherd puppy in our first computer, a big Macintosh in, and came back, and 3 weeks later worked Harvest the year that Rachael opened the tasting room in 1985. But it was always about the community, the beauty of the place. It was definitely about the deliciousness of the wine, but it was a combo. It wasn't about only the business. It was about an amazingly small community at that time that was very cohesive, even though geographically spread out. And it was about families. We didn't have children then, although we'd been together 19 years, but we soon did thereafter because kids were involved in everything. So to me it was the place and the community as well as the quality of the wine that knocked me out.
Top that, Sam.
Well, it certainly wasn't. It wasn't Oregon that first got me into wine. I was in college and majoring in East Asian studies and planning to go to business in school in Virginia. And after graduation, I followed a girlfriend out to LA where she was finishing up UCLA. Not Cheryl, but someone else. And I had been working at a wine store in San Francisco growing up. During college, going back just to get cheap beer and summer money and whatnot. And I happened to get a job at a wine store in Los Angeles called Wally's, which is one of the premier wine shops not only in Los Angeles but the West Coast. And I at some point during that couple of years that I was there, I fell out of love with my girlfriend. She left and fell in love with wine. I decided to stay, and as my dad said at that point, throw away all my education. And I knew I wanted to do something in wine, but I didn't know what I really wanted to do. And one night I happened to have dinner with a guy named Andrei Chelichev, who's sort of the founder of California, one of the founders of the California wine industry, and certainly probably the founder of the Washington wine industry. And it was in celebration of his 80th birthday. And we tasted wines that he had made back to the 50s and 60s, and I had my birth year in the 70s, and he was talking not about the bricks or the TA or the pH, but he was talking about his experiences and his emotions and the people that he met, and what during each vintage and what each vintage and each wine really represented to him. And at that night I came home and told my roommates I want to be a winemaker, and as a matter of fact I still have that menu from that night that he signed to me, and it's hanging on my wall in my office. And after that it was during the time of the LA riots, and I decided I had enough of LA, bought a one-way ticket to Thailand, but ended up picking grapes in in France for 5 or 6 weeks, where I was invited then to stay for a year, and then another year, and that turned into a winemaking degree at the University of Dijon. And that was when I fell in love with Oregon in 1994, when I came here for the International Pinot Noir celebration to represent the winery that I was working at, and decided I wanted to be in Oregon within 2 years. And it took me a year. I got up here sort of late harvest in 1995. Speaking the truth.
Cheryl was the new girlfriend.
Yeah. My story a little bit different. I was a biology major, and I moved to Oregon from Los Angeles to go to Lewis and Clark, was a biology major there, moved to Spain after I graduated from college and, had one of those moments of, what am I going to do? What do I love? And I was on a road trip, and on my way back alone from the south of Spain back up to Madrid, and started driving through some vineyards, stopped, talked to some people, and the whole, I'd started playing around with, okay, what are my strengths? I'm a biology major. I could work in a lab. I could do a harvest. I could do all of this. And so I decided then I was going to leave Europe for the moment, come back to Oregon, and I came back to Oregon, and I pretty much knocked on everybody's door in the valley and said, I have a biology degree. I'm sure I can do something. I'll work for you. And I got hired in a lab, actually across the street at Veritas. The winery was owned by a doctor, and he loved the fact that I had a degree, a science degree, and I went in and started working then, and within 6 months, I had done another vintage in New Zealand, and then went back to France, worked a year in France, and back to New Zealand, and then back to Oregon. And it was something, wine was something my family always loved. It was sort of a place that my dad and I always intersected, and I loved the history of it, and we would spend a lot of time in his wine cellar and talk about bottles and regions and where things came from and all of that. And that was always far in the background, but once I realized there was the science side to it and it was in my own backyard in Oregon, I decided to come back up here and see what I can do.
I think that's interesting that Cheryl said, I realize I answered your question, not the why, but the how, how I got here. And I think the why is probably equally important, that,
Is it my fault?
Bill, you having fun over there, Bill? I think that the why was part because of Andrei Chelichev. My mom's an artist, but I can't paint. I always wanted to play the guitar and never really took the trouble to learn, and love music and whatnot. But I think that wine is a medium that you can work in that's a sort of a blend of craft and art, and that it also, especially here in Oregon, marks a very particular year. Each vintage is different, and so to be able to really participate in something like that, I think, is a really special gift. Not a gift that I have, but a gift to me. And to be able to create something that's a combination of nature and art and a craft, and to be able to have people share that at a table and have it represent something different to them, and share a region, but also a time in your life, and also a whole lot of other things, and friendship at a table that's a pretty unique thing to be able to do in the world, and it's pretty cool. And I think that's sort of the why for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and growing up in Los Angeles, it wasn't until I moved to Oregon that I realized, seasons really do exist. This is why they call it harvest. Wow, there's one time of year, and Thanksgiving, and I mean, that struck me hard moving to Oregon from a place that you could have strawberries that all year round, and they didn't taste very good. So, really being in Oregon and realizing the cycle of the year in a much richer and deeper way was impressed upon me, even as a 21-year-old or a 20-year-old. So another reason that wine was so interesting. And as Sam said, just the blend of all of that and capturing a year in a bottle was something that was unique and pretty amazing thing to do.
Historically, we have an intricate connection across the street with Veritas. Mm-hmm. So when Deb and I came in '85, we worked first harvest there. And then I was eventually hired by the Druin family to develop their business in Oregon. The first vintage of Druin was done across the street at Veritas in 1988.
Yeah.
Cheryl's there, and then Michael, our winemaker, worked with Cheryl when it became Cheryl over there. So
that's true.
we've all wound on this hillside for a long time.
And yours was 80, what year were you over there, your first year?
85.
85.
85 for Veritas. The DDO rented that new back building in 88.
Got it.
I don't think it's new any longer.
No,
Yeah.
not close. Yeah, I continued to work there after harvest. Bill went on to do other things, but I really was, I sometimes say, we don't need people like I was with grapes in your eyes. You know, I just was in love with everything to do about it. I should have told John Howison I had a biology degree too, and maybe I would have had a different career, but no, I didn't open my mouth about that apparently. But falling in love with wine, this was very specific and it was in love, but growing up in Detroit, we didn't drink wine. My parents, I grew up in the 50s, they had cocktail hour, you know, it wasn't about wine at all. I discovered wine when I learned how to cook from an Italian. That was, of course, then you had to have wine with the meals, and those were fun times, and learned how important the synergy is between wine and food. They just make food come alive and sing and sparkle, and wine, sharing a bottle of wine, and all of the things Sam says about reminiscing about what were you doing in that year when those grapes were growing, and it's only once a year you get to have that opportunity. That really was fun, and we never stopped enjoying wine with our meals from that point on. But Oregon Pinot Noir was a different thing. We hadn't had enough money or knowledge, I suppose, to even seek out Burgundies really, so we didn't understand about this grape that you watch out, you'll fall in love with it. And Burgundies weren't as abundant then in the United States, and they were expensive, so we hadn't explored that. We drank things like Barolos, Italian wines, and Bordeaux's. So experiencing Oregon Pinot Noir was a shock. It was revelatory. It was accessible even when young. It was mercurial. It was exciting and delicious, and took my enjoyment of wine to a whole different level.
I think that's true. I came back from France in 1995 in the summer. I decided it was time to leave, and was working for a fellow named Ted Lemon, who has a winery down in California called Literai, and Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays, and he also was a consultant. And he said, well, I'm consulting on this Oregon project that's sort of new, but I can't really tell you about it. It's a little bit of a secret. And I said, okay. And so I made a stop in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where my family had had a cabin for a long time, but had sold it when I was 10, but I continued to go up there. And I was living in my friend Dennis's backyard in a tent. And Dennis was a wine store manager for a store called Dornan's, and Dornan's is sort of this complex of a chuck wagon and a wine store and a bar and other things, and it's right in Moose, Wyoming, right on the other side of the Tetons. So I was working in this wine store, and you look out and the Tetons are right there. And one night at a party, Dennis said, here, I want you to try this wine, and he pulled it out, and it was blind, and he poured it around, and I just come off of 2 years in Burgundy and tasting a lot of Burgundy and whatnot, and I tried the wine. I said, that's the best domestic Pinot Noir I've ever had in my life. And it ended up being a 1993 Archery Summit Premier Cuvée. It was the first release from Archery Summit. And
The story should be Veritas.
Yeah, I know. I know. Sorry.
I think that needs to be changed.
But Dornan's got that one 6-pack of wine for all of Wyoming. They were the only store to receive the 1 6-pack. It was a tremendous wine store. Anyway, when I got to Napa and started working for Ted said, oh, well, the project I'm consulting on in Oregon is Archery Summit. So it was a nice synergy there. And I had met Gary Andrus, who was the general manager owner of Archery Summit in 1993 in Burgundy, when I was working at the Domain. He came by to taste, and he offered me a job to do harvest, and I said, no, I'm going to work here in Burgundy. So I don't know. I like the Veritas and the Chehalem and the Domaine Drouin, and it was a really small industry. I mean, I realized it was a little bit bigger at that point from the start from the early 70s, but at the same time it was pretty small, and a pretty small circle, and the circle of people that made at that time and still do make great Pinot Noir around the world is still pretty small, but it was even smaller at that.
Yeah, that circle is still pretty tight between the people in New Zealand and Burgundy and Oregon. That same group sort is still, I don't know, again, like you said, not the founding group in the 70s, but is sort of a strong community from that early 90s.
Well, as late as 97, I saw a photo the other day of pretty much the whole wine industry in front of Nick's.
Yeah.
And you could get everybody in that photo in front of the restaurant. And today, you need Linfield's football field.
The other small thing is also when I went to work for Archery Summit in Gary, Archery Summit was in between Bill and Deb's house and Domaine Druin.
Oh, yeah.
And Bill and Gary were mortal enemies at that point. I mean, wouldn't talk to each other other than screaming at the phone, screaming at each other on the phone, and leaving messages. It was a.
Sam was told not to talk to the enemy.
Couldn't talk to the enemy. We couldn't buy Domaine Druin wine at Archery Summit. Yeah.
So it took a long time before we all met.
And I did this, and I was completely unprovoked.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, I'd like to hear from you a little bit on how you fell in love with Oregon Pinot Noir, a little bit of why wine, because we may have skipped over you.
Well,
He was actually being flipped, so we can move on.
well, Deb's and my story was really the same, and that's why I was kind of flipped with that, because I was going to let her tell the story, and there's really not much different to it. I had a business background before this. Originally, I was an art history major, and then master's degree in English, writing poetry, and decided I wanted to eat, so I got an MBA and had a corporate career that only had one thing in common, and that's I didn't like working for $10 billion corporations, and they didn't like me working for them. So it was really, for me, it was a matter of, I've got to do something else. And, you know, like so many of the early stories of wine, I think wine now, more people are going to Davis, getting trained, saying this is my career path, this is what I want to do. But, I mean, even for all four of us, we just fell into it. And if you go back to the founders of the industry, they all fell into it. It's just people came, and there was a little bit of a Chautauqua here. And so when we came and someone said, here, work harvest, and we went back to St. Louis and sold it, and said, okay, let's try this. And frankly, I didn't think I'd ever be in the wine business. You know, I looked at it, I said, I don't have the capital to do this, and I don't know how to make wine. And, you know, in those days, I often said, I'm surprised how many people have been doing it for a long time and haven't figured out either one of those things. But I got involved in venture capital startups, and I was doing consulting, and it just happened that Druin came in, and they needed someone to do the development study, and I was the business consultant that was available. So I kind of fell into it in a back way. Now, I'm very lucky I did, because it beats having a real job. I mean, you know, even though some days around here it's a real job. But you know, I think that, again, if you ask people, you know, the path wasn't, they woke up one morning and said, wine, I would love, you know, you have a lot of people getting into it today who don't have quite enough money for a baseball team, and they have a really nice wine cellar, so their friends say, you should have a $10 million winery, you know, but that is, I love wine, so I'll have a winery proposition, but back then, I don't think anybody was saying, was really coming at, but once we got into it, and then it started to, you know, it was like a flower. It started to bloom and started to unfold, and then we became immersed in it, and there was really nothing else you wanted to do.
It's funny, didn't David Lett go to Davis?
He did. He wanted to be a dentist first, but he'd left Utah to go to Davis and shifted his focus, and they then said he couldn't make wine here. I ended up working for David in those early years. I was working at Veritas, and then Nick asked me if I'd work at Nick's Italian Cafe. I had never worked in a restaurant, so I started as a prep cook and washed dishes and was a waitress. It was a great experience. I was in my mid-30s and had degrees and careers, but I had never worked in a restaurant, and it was the end of its centricity as the gathering place for winemakers in the community, and there weren't very many. I think there were maybe 12 wineries in Yamhill County when we came, maybe 8. There weren't very many. And people would show up there, so they'd have tastings. In the early industry, people sold anything they could, so they hadn't kept cellars, and when a wine writer would come and want to taste through different vintages, they would have to go to Nick's because he was the only one who had those old vintages, so it was really a central place. And I got to know David Lett there. Actually, Bill and I and John Thomas had asked permission to come in on a Saturday morning after there'd been a retrospective of one of Irie's tastings, including the famous 75 South Block Reserve. And so we sat there in the mess at the bar in Nick's and tasted through. We were very serious. We're taking notes. It's just the little dregs. There was only one bottle empty. That was the South Block. I had tasted it subsequently several times, but then to thank Nick, we decided we'd clean up the restaurant. And so we vacuumed and cleaned, and Nick asked me to do prep for the soup and said I knew my way around a knife. That's how he hired me, but because we were there because of David Lett. And then eventually David hired me. He called me his first employee. That wasn't true, but I was the first person he trusted in the offices. I set up his new office and his systems, and that was very private for him, so it was nice to be trusted. And I also worked in the cellar, and that was the year that Veronique Drouin came over to do her stage. You had to do an apprenticeship 100 kilometers from your home, so Oregon qualified. And she did 1/3 of her time with Bethel Heights, 1/3 with Irie, and 1/3 with Adelsheim. So I got to know her and worked with her. We'd sit outside and eat a cookie every day. It was fun. She's a great gal. And so subsequently got to know her parents a little bit. And then when they bought the property the following year, both Davids knew Bill was an MBA, the only MBA hanging around the Red Hills without much to do, and asked him if he would consider writing a business plan for that. But that point was a real pivot point, not just because of Drouin, but because of why we captured Drouin, I think. In 1987, it was the first International Pinot Noir celebration. So when they were pitching that idea, it was actually a businessman in downtown McMinnville who pitched it to a few people, including Nick. I was there when he came in to pitch it, and it was a huge hurdle to think of where would they house this. So I remember it was quite a long discussion and not a done deal that Linfield would allow alcohol on the property, even in the summer when no students were there. And so that was quite a difference for Linfield College, for McMinnville. But I think even more importantly, Sam and Cheryl were saying how the connection between New Zealand and Burgundy and Oregon is strong. I think that's when it became more solidified, because although it was the first time there was ever a celebration or a festival for one variety that we know of in the world, we didn't say it was Oregon's celebration, Oregon's Pinot Noir thing. We invited people from all over the world for the very first one. And associated with that, IPNC, right from the get-go, was the gathering at Steamboat Inn for winemakers only. And the price of admission that year was you had to bring a flawed wine. The Burgundians were a bit flummoxed because they'd never made one, but they did go to they did go, and during those discussions, I remember I talked to Robert Drouin about this a number of times. It was so shocking to have people, with all honesty, talking about, my God, what went wrong here? What did I do? What would you have done? And all of that. And Robert told me that he had never visited his colleagues' wineries. That's probably true. He said that he had never discussed winemaking with his colleagues. That was probably true. And he said that he had never tasted his colleagues' wines. I don't believe that for a second, but regardless, he said that. And I think that insular quality of Burgundy, that you have secrets and how you do this that are passed down generations to generations, and that that protectiveness, David Lett shared that to some degree, that it's private, you don't share what you've done. That in stark contrast didn't really change the vanguard at the time in Burgundy. It certainly didn't really change Robert's opinions. But the great exciting news was that the young generation was there in force. Véronique Drouin, Dominique Lafon, Christophe Roumier, Patrice Rion. This group went back to Burgundy and started a tasting group that is still meeting to this day. And I believe that Oregon and the IPNC changed winemaking for the better in the world by that sharing of information and openness.
So we're still on your first question. Did you bring overnight bags?
We have some sustenance, yes. But that's amazing to hear. We had never quite heard that story told before, on the influence Oregon had on Burgundy.
A question for Sam and Cheryl, most specifically. You guys both mentioned a great deal of abroad experience early on in your lives and careers, and I'm curious how that influenced what you brought back, and if the value you feel you got from working abroad and living abroad early on.
Cheryl?
You go first.
Me?
Yeah, sorry. Give me a second.
I know. Speaking abroad, I just flew in this morning from Southern Oregon, so I'm like rearranging my thoughts. It's interesting that Deb mentioned that tasting group, because when I was in Burgundy, I was working in a winery called Domaine de l'Arlot, and I actually got to go to that tasting group several times when I was working there, and that's where I met Véronique and some of the other folks, Christophe Roumier and whatnot. I think that the greatest gift of working in Burgundy was certainly, and this is sort of trite, but a respect for the authenticity of, the French say terroir, and I hesitate to use that a little bit in the direct French term, because if you talk to the French, at least when I was there, it was really about the soil, it was about the place, and I've grown now to believe terroir, to use that, or uniqueness in companies, it's a combination of the soil, the winemaker, the climate, the ethos of the place in which the grapes are grown and the wine is made. But certainly in Burgundy, there's a tremendous respect for where the grapes are grown. So that was certainly number one. To have that respect was a huge influence on me. I think number two was in Burgundy, because a lot of the vineyards are broken up, not all, but a lot. The first place that I worked was I was dropped off. I just traveled around the world for 9 months, and I showed up in Dijon, in Beaune, in the train station, and Jean-Pierre Dissemet came and got me, and he brought me to the winery, then dropped my bag off, and then he drove me out to the vineyard and dropped me off in Romilly-Saint-Vivant to work with the crew right across from Romilly-Conti, which is pretty amazing first day. But what I also began to notice after I'd spent time there was, and this goes back to the land as well, is the land where there was conventional farming being done, not even the land, the ground was dead. It was completely dead. And on the other side, where they were doing biodynamic farming or organic or whatnot. The soil was absolutely alive, and I thought, geez, we have maybe 50 chances in our lives to make great wine, especially in a great vineyard like Romany Saint Vivant. The ground's just absolutely dead. Not where I was working, but I'm not going to name the winery. And so that was number 2, I think, was that goes along with respect for the place. It's how to treat that place. And then I think lastly, for me, young Pinot Noir is really pretty, but old Pinot Noir is really beautiful. So I set my sights on wanting to make a wine that could age and evolve and could become something other than what it was at the beginning. And to me, those are sort of the real big 3 takeaways from Burgundy. Other than the eating and the drinking and the general lust for life and all that, and the long dinners and the taking the time that the French tend to do. My father just came back from France, but he lived there for 30 years, so I was fairly familiar with France when I got there, when I got to Burgundy. But it also on the, I'm not going to say the negative side, but the amount of tradition that's been codified in law and not even codified, that hangs over a lot of those winemakers' heads, also spurred me on to, I think, incorporate in my DNA creativity and innovation, which has helped me here in the United States. You can't, there's certain things you just can't be creative in France, due to laws, but there's also that, if you're 19th generation, handed down, 21st generation, Cheryl and I have friends, we all have friends that are 19th or 21st or 22nd generation, father-daughter, father-son. That's a lot of tradition on your shoulders. It's not like that little guy from, I was thinking about Dennis from what was that movie with the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer? I want to be a dentist. If you're the heir, you're going to be a winemaker, and you're going to do it this way. And I think that's changing a little bit, but at least when I was there, that pressure was so intense. And so, I took that away. We've got 3 kids, and I have no expectation or no pressure that should be winemakers. They can do what they want. Or if someone comes to us in the cellar and says, hey, I think this is a better way to do this, we'll take a look at it and we'll say, okay, yes, it's a better way. It might not be the way we've always done things, but we're open to that change. And so I think that was a big influence on me as well.
A major impetus for Jordan coming to Oregon was the opportunity to experiment.
Absolutely.
With winemaking, vineyards, that you weren't constrained by how you had to plant, how you could make wine, and I remember he said that many times. There's so many things I can try to do here.
Well, I think that there's the challenge in that. The reverse in the challenge is that now, with information traveling so quickly around the world, with interns now that don't just go do 1 or 2 harvests. I was in one place for 2 years. But with interns maybe doing up to 4 or 5 harvests a year and traveling around the world, now we have, especially in winemaking and viticulture, this exchange of ideas, which is great, because I don't think there's been really a better time in the history of the wine world to have high quality wine for wherever you are in the world. On the downside, there's this homogenization of wine that's going on, and we're losing some of the uniqueness of each region because of all the yeasts are the same, all the enzymes, all those things, all the ideas in the vineyard are sort of the same. So we need to be careful as we move forward that we use a lot of these exchange of ideas, but we also use them to not to make wines similar, but to continue to make wines unique, and even find ways to make them more unique from that region and more expressive from that region. Sorry, I went on way too long.
Well, no, what you're saying is interesting, because there are as we started, a lot of strengths of pooling your knowledge, but then, there reaches a point where there's maybe a downside of homogenization, and I feel like we were sort of on the beginning edge of pooling knowledge from everywhere, and and the internet wasn't around when
we didn't have cell phones back then. I know it's amazing to consider, but
it was interesting. It's the first time I thought about you, Sam, going to one place, landing in the vineyard, and seeing the whole growing season, where my experience was incredibly different. That I came in at the end of the growing season, and worked a harvest in the New World. It was an Old World, so it was about these grapes and how you make wine out of it. And so I got the whole idea of how you make wine without seeing an entire season. And I sort of jumped with New World winemaking to begin with. So I was in Oregon, my first vintage, 93. It was a smaller vintage. It was cool vintage. That, you know, long summer that people weren't expecting to be a really great vintage, but pulled it out in the end. And there were all these New World winemakers, like Steve Dorner had just showed up at Christum, and I met him at a tasting, and, you know, would talk to people about where do you go and what do you do and how do you do another vintage. And I had the opportunity to go to New Zealand very quickly, and I thought, oh, I can't do this, it's not planned, it's not anything. And my mom, even of all people, she was saying, you know what, when do you get this opportunity? Go. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll go. I've only had a job for a few months, but he has a friend in New Zealand that has a winery there, and so I did that transition really quickly. And again, for me, it's about connection and people and how this all works as this big network. But I met great people who I still know now who have great wineries in New Zealand or in France or wherever, you know, working in Oregon, all around in the Pinot Noir, cool climate world. So doing that and really being able to see the world, I'm visual. I'm not going to remember by drinking a wine and just having the bottle. For me, I need to walk through the vineyard and say, oh, okay, that's Martinborough, that's Marlborough, and up on that ridge, it looks like that. So I was able to get a broad view of the world, and at least New Zealand, and winemaking very quickly. So sort of map wines around the world. And a big thing in New Zealand at the time, and is probably still a big thing, is all of these people who had been in Australia and been in Europe, and you know, you're on this small island where you're not getting a lot of imported wines, and there's this richness and history in Australia, wines that we were never getting back in the US, and people played this game called options, and there were teams, and you would go to intense tasting groups, and then you would play this game where you would smell a wine, and people would say, okay, is it from the old world or the new world? Is it, you know, these are your 3 varietals, is it one of these? What are the vintages? And so just getting into wine, I was on a team, and we went to competitions. It was a late vintage, and so my first month was doing a lot of tasting, and it was interesting seeing the Southern Hemisphere in depth in those wines, and then a lot of luckily being with people whose parents ran a winery and were wine geeks for a long time, and so I got to sit in on these amazing old champagne tastings and Bordeaux tastings and things like that I maybe wouldn't have gotten the opportunity to do here. So traveling and being with younger people who were intensely geeky about getting to know wines of the world. So I had those opportunities, and came back to Oregon again. Then I went back to New Zealand because I sort of had my network and loved the going back and forth option, or just having all of that experience. Then some of my friends in New Zealand had gone to France at the same time. Anyway, we can talk about this later, but so many different weaving. We all sort of ended up back at the same place. I took a job the next year in Burgundy that was right next door to where Sam was.
Across the street.
Across the street, which was right down the street from Bill and Deb's friends and from the people at Veritas and all of that. And so getting the opportunity to go to Burgundy, and again, like Sam said, walk through these vineyards and taste wines and be involved in tasting groups. And I spent about 6 months traveling with a friend, and really these are wines I never would be able to purchase being a 23, 24-year-old, but we spent a number of months tasting at domains all throughout France in different areas, also in Italy, you know, Alsace, Bordeaux, sorry, not Bordeaux, Alsace, Burgundy, Sancerre, everywhere. And that was an opportunity, and wines like the mental map, I would have never had the chance to make if I had to buy every single one of those bottles of wine. So I'm rambling. But in general, traveling really allowed me to taste wines, look at the vineyard, get out there, hear the story of all of these different people in different places. And I think that is something that, you know, I wouldn't have been able to do unless I were boots on the ground, walking around and meeting these people. So that was a pretty amazing opportunity.
That's such an important point, Cheryl. The people that were in the industry when we came in '85 had a very, you have a word for it, Bill, I can't think of the word, but you get this palate. What is the word?
Provincial.
Well,
Cellar palate?
I think it's a house palate.
That we only drank our own wines, and nobody really had the money and the ways to buy all of these wines from around the world. And although we began to have tastings, many of the tastings were the history of the Oregon wine industry, because some of us had come around the same time. I remember our tasting group had John Paul from Cameron and Rollin Souls, who these people all just came a little bit after that. Ken Wright came. I mean, it was a group of not the people who had been here in the 70s. So we were trying to educate ourselves. What were these Oregon wines like? Did they age? And we would then buy some Burgundies for that tasting, but it didn't have the sense of place and people and the map that you're talking about, Cheryl. So we made an effort, but I would say that the original people who were here drank their own wines, and then you get that palate that's where you prefer Oregon wines. You just know Oregon wines rather than this broader view that I think without the internet, without cell phones, was useful, helpful as people came who had this broader experience and brought that to Oregon.
Yeah, it was impossible to do unless you went somewhere and you drove around and you called them up, and you weren't making appointments online the same way. You know, it's long distance phone calls, and you're knocking on cellar doors or trying to set up an appointment. And it sounds so ridiculous. It wasn't that long ago. Yeah, it was, but 20 plus years ago.
23 years ago.
We weren't born.
Right. I know. Okay. Sorry. Anyway.
And the reverse has happened now with Burgundians going out into the world, especially here in Oregon. But at the time that the Drouins decided to make wine here, they were the only Burgundians who were currently making Burgundy to make Pinot Noir anywhere else in the world. That was a very risky proposition. Where's the win in this for Robert? He does a great job. His colleagues in Burgundy think, oh great, thanks so much, and he does a lousy job, and they're all, I told you so. But today, look how many Burgundians either have something going here, or have come to make wine here, or exchange. It's the reverse now. We went out, but now they're coming here.
Yeah, that's true.
I think it's all mixed up. You know, you've got Americans in New Zealand, you have Kiwis here, Burgundians here, Americans over in Burgundy. It's just, it's once again, it's that fine Pinot Noir wine world. You know, it's pretty small. Pinot Noir is not a huge chunk of the market. It is growing, but especially when you get up into the upper quality end, it's a pretty small world, and it's growing, but we still know most of the folks.
Well, we've had interns from,
Kenya,
15 countries.
Philippines.
Yeah.
Kenya, India, Jamaica.
Trinidad.
Yeah.
And then on our staff now, we've had 2 Kiwi winemakers. We have one.
And we have a
French.
an Aussie, a French.
An Aussie.
And Yamhill used to
Two
be
French.
long distance, right? And Yamhill used to be long distance for interns.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
So how did you all meet? What brought you together?
Gary.
I still remember that phone call that started.
No. I gave you $20 before the meeting.
There was a great phone call from Bill that was on, back when they had, when you had answering machines that had the tape, and that lasted for a long time at Archery Summit. The tape was played several times.
2 in the morning, the bird cannon was loud, but it was good.
Well, Cheryl and I met at Tina's in Dundee in '96.
Even though you worked across?
Well, we worked across, so Cheryl arrived in Burgundy a month after I left.
Oh.
But we had all these friends in common, and it's a long story.
It's a long story, but friends in common.
This guy Mike Worsing, who owns a vineyard down in New Zealand now called Pyramid Valley Vineyard. I had met another guy, Matt Donaldson, who was one of the owners at Pegasus Bay, where Cheryl was working.
Where I worked in '94, and
Matt and I had dinner the last night he was in Burgundy, and he was working across the street from me, and he said, well, you got to meet this woman, Cheryl, she's great, she worked for us. And I said, fine, whatever. And then my friend Mike went down to Australia to work with James Holliday, I think.
Yeah.
And I said, Mike, so if you go to New Zealand, you got to go to this winery, Pegasus Bay. So Mike rucks up, and there's Cheryl doing harvest at Pegasus Bay, and Mike said, you got to meet this guy Sam, and Matt was really drunk, and he kept saying, what was it? Sam's a dude!
well, everybody kept saying, even the gardener at
across the street at the Mandalore.
Yeah, at Rion. I went and had lunch at this little pub. I guess it's
Cafe.
called a pub. Yeah, cafe, bistro. Thank you. Next to the winery. And
I think it was the only restaurant in Primo in the little town.
Yeah, that's true. He was like, oh, I'm the gardener next door, and he was trying to practice his English, and he's like, oh, you're from America. Do you know Sam?
He's a dude.
No, I don't know Sam. Oh, Sam worked here, and I was always like, oh, that's funny. No, I don't know Sam. And then I would meet somebody else, and they're like, oh, you're what? Do you know Sam? I'm like, America's a big place. But then after a while, it kept being the same guy, Sam, and then...
Well, so I went down I went down to Napa, and you and Liz were coming back up through. I think it was Liz. After Burgundy, and I had worked for Ted Lemon, and I met this guy, Blair Walter, who's now the winemaker owner at Felton Road in New Zealand. And Blair said, oh, you should meet this woman, Cheryl, she's great. And I left to go up to Oregon, and I think it was like 2 weeks or something after I left, Cheryl came up, and you guys went to a going away party for Blair, right?
Yeah, well, every time I would go back and forth, I would stop in Napa. And Blair was a friend from my first harvest, so that's what I mean. There are all these people that knit everybody together. Yeah, and he said, oh, my friend Sam just moved to Oregon. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. This is an absolute joke. I was
Cheryl
like, oh, Sam, who was in Burgundy?
Yeah, and you were going out with a brewer at the time.
Yeah, I know that part of the story. Yeah, I was going out with a brewer. This is a funny story, but I went to Salt Lake City, where he was just opening up a brew pub, and we're sitting there playing darts, and I met this new boss of his, and he said, oh, my stepdad, or it was like ex-stepdad, something like that, he owns a winery in Oregon. And you're going back to Oregon. It's called Archery Summit. And I was like, now you're going to tell me about this guy, Sam. Because
was this 96 or 95?
And I was like, because my friend Blair had just said, oh, my friend Sam's working at Archery Summit. And I was like, you're going to tell me about this guy, Sam, right? And he was like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never met anybody named Sam. I just know that he owns this winery. And I was like, this guy, Sam, works for him that I've heard of. And then my boyfriend at the time was like, who's Sam? I was like, no, it's a joke. I've never met this guy. I just keep hearing about him. So then I left there. It was my first day across the street. And I said to Harry, do you know the people at Archery Summit?
Harry Peterson.
Yeah, Harry Peterson Edry. I was like, do you know this guy, Sam? I keep hearing about him. And he was like, no, I don't. And then Harry and I went out to lunch at Tina's. And
we were at lunch.
Tina's was like the size of this room. And he said, oh, that's the Archery Summit crew over there. I was like, oh, okay, whatever. You know, one of them must be Sam. I'm going to call him next week or so. And they all come filing out.
And we were being sort of loud and obnoxious. She's like, who are
care.
those
We were
obnoxious
talking. And
people over there?
So Harry yells out as they're passing by the door, and Harry's like, Sam! I'm like, oh God, what are you doing? And then Sam turns around and
That was it?
that was it. We talked. We went on a date.
Tina's,
Anyway, It's funny.
Tina's
That was my story. That was more than you wanted to know, but.
And then in answer to your question, how we all got together,
Well, how I think when I met you was with the Housens.
Oh,
They had dinner,
They had
and I
dinner.
think that's the first time I met you,
Housens,
Sam. So the owners of Veritas. So again, it's an incestuous little community.
and then when we got together to do this, we didn't know one another well.
Well, Deb came to our wedding.
Yeah, Deb came
Yes.
our way.
And I
Because
had my
you
dad.
all were good friends with Harry, and
Right.
Cheryl was working for
Right.
Harry, and you couldn't come because of your back.
Yeah.
But you got to remember,
And
so
David and
my
Tina.
boss Gary and Bill, and to a certain extent Deb. I mean, it was like oil and water. I mean, this was not a good relationship, to put it mildly. So I didn't know Bill and Deb really at all.
But when we got together to do this, we were all going out to do our own little projects, and
We were retiring on Francis Tannahill and Hatcher.
yeah,
It's
we
gonna
were,
be
and so
great.
We were
Bill
going to
and
the
I were
traditional
all-
Oregon
All
winery.
1,500 cases.
Yeah.
Deb said, well, why don't we, there's a lot of good bulk wine on the market, let's go source some, put it together, and help fund the project. Well, we ran into Sam and Cheryl doing the same thing, and so, well, Deb said, well, why don't we just throw in together and do this? And we're going to only make the first vintage of A to Z together, split the proceeds, and then go do our own projects. And it took off, and we all looked at one another. Christmas that first year, 2002, we went out to dinner at Red Hills in Dundee and said, Oregon doesn't need another $50 bottle of wine. That was in 2002. We have been creating.
But we'd all been making $50 bottles of
Yeah,
wine,
we've
which
been
is
making
fairly
$50 bottles
ironic.
of wine and said, this is what we want to do. And so, we took what was going to be an ad hoc project and became partners and have been ever since.
I think, it was that one seller, we can't say what it is, we were competing to buy some bulk wine, and it was Bill and Deb and me, right? Cheryl was working at the time. I think I had
I had a
left.
job.
Yeah.
Cheryl had a job. I didn't have a job. We were going to be the traditional small Oregon wineries, and that's what we were going to do. And, we didn't have any money. We didn't come from a long... we weren't, none of us were the 18th generation in line in winemaking family, nor had we... Was the internet bubble hadn't done anything at that point. So none of us came from, a really wealthy background. So we were looking at a way to help fund our small businesses to try to get some revenue. And we hit upon this negociant idea. And I remember we were tasting that. Deb called up that night and said, why don't we join forces? And I quickly said, well, I've got to check with Cheryl.
Deb texted you.
No, there was no such thing.
They really said it to you at the
thing.
barrel,
Yeah,
yeah.
maybe, yeah.
But I had protected a little money for the Children's College Fund, and so that's how we were going to buy the bulk wine. And then when we joined forces, we were able to do it. We had such different skills, it worked out really well. During those first years, Cheryl had 3 babies. She
Yeah,
did
that
2
was
houses.
that was my skill.
And had a job for another year. But for Bill and Sam and me, especially in the beginning, it was intense. And so Sam and Cheryl were responsible primarily for the blend, but Sam had to source. He was a bulldog going around the whole state. He would contract for 1-acre properties because we needed more and more wine. It was unbelievable. And Bill had the business background, so was able to help us get funding and establish a business plan that we thought made sense. And
Well, we had just planted our
yeah.
vineyard
We had just planted
too,
our vineyard,
and
had a baby.
And I was still making wine at Chehalem.
I guess we started the company we bottled before Theo was born.
Yeah. It was 2001.
Bought it on
August
August 13th, the hottest day of the summer at
Rob Stewart.
Rob Stewart's.
One thing I was going to say though about how we started that is that always drives me nuts is that you hear it, or you know, there's a subcurrent of, well, if we had their money, you know, anybody could do what you did. We didn't have any money.
We had no money.
We built this thing on nothing, and I want that in the historical record.
Unless we built it on a little bit borrowed money. Yeah.
I've never heard that, but what I do remember from it was like, oh, well, it's only, you know, you're just making $18 wine. Like, we weren't making that, so there was a little bit of that feeling in the beginning of like, oh, wow, nobody's had this niche. Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing, or how is that going to reflect on the Oregon wine industry? But over time, we just found out, you know what, it's a lot harder to make great under $20 Oregon Pinot Noir.
At the amount of wine.
At the amount of time. At first we were like, oh, this is easy. And then you're like, well, actually, if you're going to have a sustainable business and you're trying to make under $20 Pinot Noir, that's a lot harder than we thought. And
well, the first vintage was sort of easy. I mean, but things changed rapidly.
The first vintage was, but pretty much we've become the entree to those more expensive Oregon Pinot Noirs.
That, you know, I make 300-400 cases of a $50 bottle of wine. I can also make a nice dinner for 6 people. But to make 200,000 cases of A to Z Pinot Noir is like running a 4-star restaurant at 400 covers a night and getting them all right. It's a completely different dimension in winemaking. And I remember when the first wines that we blended, I think it was the first Cascade Cuvée, you were out of town, but we were at the house at Pearl, and it was just pouring rain. Remember, it was just buckets of rain. And
I remember that in our little...
I was making Hatcher at ERAP, and I had tools. We needed a cylinder to blend in to get things right. And I said, well, all this stuff's up at ERAP. So I got to go unlock the gate. I got to find the lights in the middle of the night, and it's pouring. And Sam said, no. He said, we can do this here. You remember how we did that? It was Big Daddy's Pleasure Measure. We did it with a shot glass.
It's a shot glass that said Big Daddy's Pleasure Measure on the side, and had different ounces, and that's what we
different ounces. We did that. That was one of the best early wines we made. Boy, that one was great. And it was made in a shot glass.
You have to remember at that time, you know, Oregon wine sales were...
shot glasses.
There were only shot glasses.
We didn't have an iPhone.
We had to trash through the trash.
Carry the ashes in the coals. All uphill.
Oregon should go out and see our lab.
Oregon wines weren't selling all that well. I mean, they were selling okay, but there were wineries with 3 vintages backed up into the in the warehouse. We had just gone through 2001 vintage, which was huge vintage. At Archery Summit, you know, we fermented, you know, in bathtubs, basically. I mean, it was way over expectation.
Bathtubs at Archery Summit?
Yeah. They were gold plated. But you know, and the quality was just okay from 2001. And there were some good vintages, but with, you know, the 97 was a tough vintage that people were still digesting. 98 was really low. 99 was pretty good. 2000 was good. 2001 was huge, but not great. So there were full cellars, full warehouses, and there's a lot of wine that we could pick to make this Negociant deal work. And then the same thing in 2002, and then up to 2003. I mean, we had someone by this time we leased a small winery, which was what. Hidden Springs up in
the original
winery
in Yamhill.
And then it was Cuneo.
Then it was Cuneo, then we leased it. And I vividly remember this during harvest, a grower coming up and it started to rain, and we had filled our small winery. It was tiny, but he said, look, I've got 150 tons of Pinot Noir, and you can have it, just pay to pick it. I just don't want to see it go to waste. And we couldn't, there was nothing we could do. We just didn't have any more room. And
we were packed at 70 tons.
We were totally packed at 70 tons. And
that's funny.
And then later that year, early the next year, Sideways came out, and it really changed the Pinot Noir industry. And all of a sudden, the bulk wine disappeared. You know, I think Oregon sales grew 44% or something like that year, when we're used to 4% growth. And that's, to Deb's point, that's when we had to go downstream and go to vineyards and start buying grapes and
Well,
find
we already
places to
had
make
some.
wine. We had,
Yeah.
but really,
Yeah, well, then we were
really
totally
changed.
different,
And we went from, then all of a sudden Pinot Noir, we went from sort of leading with our Pinot Gris sales in some way, and doing well with the Pinot Noir, and all of a sudden that flip-flop Pinot Noir took off, and we were then trying to chase things to catch up and maintain the momentum that was really happening at the time. And it was just this really tremendous confluence of ideas and times, and having a really inexpensive, high quality wine that was a real value. And that really, we were doing fine, but that really launched us. I remember Bill writing those business plans, and the first business plan was, okay, well, what happens if we get to 20,000 cases? I never want to be more than 40,000 cases. No, never. And like every year, we're ripping up these new business plans.
If we're ever to 100,000 cases, but
Crazy.
to your
We're
point,
never going to buy Rachael. Never. That's just like, the jewel on the hill. Yeah.
well, to your point, I mean, we quickly got to the point, I said, oh, it's harder to make great under $20 Pinot. The first vintage or so, there was a lot of wine out there, and we had great wines to choose from, and you think back, and so we got into it, but then there were these expectations that we were growing and there was more wine out there, and we need to keep making great wine. So all of a sudden we were like, what do? We make wine. So we shouldn't be buying, we can't be a negociant. And so that's really, the tables turned very quickly when we were like, we need to get vineyard contracts, or we at least need to have, we didn't have bricks and mortar, we didn't have a winery yet. So, okay, this winery over here will make some wine for us, but we need to be there every day. We can't just depend on having people make good wine and we're buying it. We have to make sure.
Wineries in 2005.
And we've worked with over 100 vineyards.
Well, I remember Deb was
So
driving.
it became, it wasn't easy when we had to do that. This was, you want to make sure, all of a sudden people expect us to over-deliver in the bottle. So wait a second, what if there's only bad wine out there next year? We can't, how are we supposed to do that? So that quality control issue very quickly came
an
to.
ongoing conversation was how big can we get? I remember you and I were sitting out at Evergreen one day, and you said, do you think we could do 20,000 and keep the quality, and then we'll do our own projects? I went, gee, I don't know. And then we got to, I think that's
You again.
our son.
Why don't you turn it off?
Well,
He doesn't know how to.
That's probably true.
well, it's going to stop.
It's Will calling up to tell him how to turn off his phone.
And then we said, well, the question was, we wanted to stop once we knew that the quality would fall off. Mm-hmm. And we assumed, 20, and then we did okay with that, and it became 40. And just a year ago, we hired someone effectively as an assistant winemaker who had been winemaker for over a decade and had worked for 2 decades at a very large winery here in Oregon. And he came to us, took a pay cut, took a title cut, and he said, I have to see how you do this. He said winemakers, when they get together, say, because the principle is as you get bigger, the wine quality falls off. There's just things that, he said, but everyone sees you keep making better and better wine. We could have never fathomed that we could make 200,000 cases of Pinot. We make 350 total of other things, but of just one varietal, we could have never fathomed that we could have gotten better at this as we went along. And now we look and we go, what is the limit? Why wouldn't we always be able to get better? We learn more, and now we can invest in some equipment.
Well, I mean, you have to remember back when we were first getting going, 2002, 2003, and Deb was driving around in her car with that little foldable, collapsible pallet. What are those things now? The
Hand
truck, the dolly, like delivering wines up in Portland out of the back of her car. And we had a little office that used to be Alice's
Yeah,
restaurant in Dundee. and we had, we rented that place and had what, 4 computers? We owned 4 computers and a printer, I think.
You guys were in the annex
I know,
after
we
we
were in the
kept
annex,
filling it.
And
It was a closet.
It was a closet. It was an air-conditioned closet. And, so but I think part of how we got to where we are now is we've never really said no. We can't do it. It doesn't really enter into our vocabulary. It's more, how can we do it? And if we find that eventually there's something that's
No, you're right.
insurmountable, I know, something that's insurmountable, we're constantly pushing on what can we do as opposed to what can't we do.
That's a key element.
I think it's a real key. It's in our DNA.
Yeah, our bank banks of 400, 500 wine companies, and they said this is the best company culture of any of them. And last year we were ranked number 2 among small businesses in Oregon. But a keystone of the culture here is go make a mistake. Try not to do it with
Not too many.
100,000 gallons of wine, but try stuff, see what happens. And so we've done it ourselves in saying that we don't say no to things, or we say we can't do things, but we've tried to instill that with the other 50 people who work here too.
Yeah, it's not just in winemaking, it's in marketing or anything that we do.
It's not just that there isn't anything that can't be done or figuring out how to do it. It's how to be better. It's striving toward excellence. And my personal goal was never to be the biggest, it was to be the best. But they go hand in hand. However, the questioning isn't just how can we do that? It's also, should we do that? How much is enough? How big should we get? Should we get smaller? We've always challenged one another with the hard questions and haven't been afraid to look at any possibility. I think that's part of our liberal arts background. We have a lot of people with liberal arts background in our management, and that helps to look at possibilities and consider before you move ahead, but also the willingness to make a mistake. I think that has been important too. When we made that first cuvee, we still only make 1 cuvee for each of our 5 wines. That's quite a trick when you're this size. I don't think many companies much smaller than us care so much about the integrity of every bottle being identical, but we do. But that first cuvee was 2,600 cases. It looked like a mountain over there. I'm looking at Bill, business guy. I'm looking at Cheryl, still has a job, pregnant, ready to have her first child. Looking at Sam, winemaker, and I'm going, great idea, Deb. You're going to have to go sell that. I immediately multiplied by 12. How many bottles do I have to go out and hawk? But that wine was named Best American Pinot Noir under $20 by Food and Wine magazine. The joke is there wasn't another quality Pinot Noir under $20 in the world. That's a true thing. After Sideways, and you skip ahead 4 years to 2006, Food and Wine gave us that nod again, Best American Pinot Noir under $20. But that year, I think we made 51,000 cases of Pinot Noir. And that was a real testament to our concept that bigger can be better. That the more, when you have a tiny cuvee and you put 1 drop of whatever in there, it makes a difference. When you have a larger cuvee, you have nuances you can get from different wines that you've made, trying to express each vineyard, and you put it together with the skill that Sam and Cheryl brought, as you heard, from all over the world. It's remarkable, the complexity, the depth that is possible. But in the United States, I think we've bamboozled customers into believing that, like in Burgundy, where they had hundreds and hundreds of years to distinguish and define which vineyards are supreme year in, year out, I think we've apotheosized single vineyards here as well and think that we should charge the most for them. I know it's heresy, but I really believe that we should charge the most for the blends because it's the most difficult, in my view, not a winemaker, to make but it also brings the greatest complexity in my view. So that's upending paradigms, and part of the way you can get there is challenging and questioning everything all the time, pushing each other to be the best.
I think where we really learned about blending and complexity was with Jack.
Jack Irvine? No, that's wine that we made. Yeah. No, that's how we learned about innovation and pushing boundaries.
No, but
This wine that Sam made blended all kinds of white wines together.
It was no, Bill.
It wasn't true. It wasn't about the blend.
We were tasting up at a little winery, and Cheryl, we'd go around and taste, and Cheryl said, well, what's, oh, no, you know, I taste that. And we'd go around. Finally, one day she said,
Goodness.
I want to taste this. And she tasted it and goes, what the hell is in here? It seems, Chenin Blanc and Chardonnay.
That wasn't the point at all. That wasn't the
My
point.
stories don't have to match. My story's better. And she looked saying, she said, you're such a jackass. And so it became, we sold it under Jack with a little donkey on the label.
So the wine was the real story.
Oh, okay.
That's a better one.
The
I
jackass
like
thing
that.
is true, but Cheryl and I, our best friend was Jimmy Brooks, and so I'm sure you've well documented this. He passed away in 2004, and we'd actually that night. The night before he passed away, we had a dinner at Tina's, a small dinner, a group of us. I don't know how many people were there, 8 maybe? Or Pip was her first. And so Cheryl had gone to get our intern for the 2004 harvest up in the airport, and Jimmy and I drove to the dinner together that night, and we were talking about Georgian wines, because I think he had just been in Georgia, and this skin contact orange wines, and we'd been sort of tasting those or talking about them for a year and a half, and so anyway, we had that dinner, and of course the next morning we woke up. We had bought cows together, Jimmy and Cheryl and I, and we were unloading some cows that next morning at Bill and Deb's house. There's a great story of Bill chasing the cows after they broke out in his Italian loafers in a bathrobe down Archery Summit Road. The cow project was relatively short-lived, but
Bill calls you. It's about 6 a.m. How do you get the cows back? And you said, just beat on a bucket. So Bill goes out. He goes out and he's beating on the bucket in his loafers. Pretty soon they're following him, and Bill's thinking, I have about 1 million tons of meat following me with big horns, and he's thinking, what are they going to do when I find out the bucket's empty?
give me your loafers. So anyway, we woke up the next morning. We were and putting the cows into their pen, and we got because Jimmy was supposed to meet us there, and so we got and help us. And we kept calling him. Anyway, we got the news, and so we decided that harvest that we'd make. I decided by myself that we'd make
That's the
this
story.
skin contact wine, and it was Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, and Pinot Blanc, and we fermented it like a red, and then aged it on the skins until Easter morning when we took it out of the barrel and pressed it. But Cheryl did say, you jackass, when she saw it. But it was also, Jimmy was a pretty stubborn guy, so it was also sort of that donkey was a little bit of a representation of him on the label. If you look really closely at the label, the donkey on the label is wearing gum boots, rubber boots. Yeah, so.
You have to give me a break. I was like, I had a 2-year-old. I was pregnant.
Yeah.
We were making all Jimmy's wines there, and
Not all, but a good chunk.
a big chunk of them there.
Yeah.
We had the winery filled to 11, and
Was that the year you threw the mug at my head?
I think so. I was like, we really don't need to take on anything else. And we were starting A to Z, so it's like, keep everything.
And this was 2004 vintage.
2004.
38 cases of it, and I think we finally sold out 2000.
Last week.
I think it was the first orange wine out of Oregon.
Yeah,
Definitely
I
the first
know
orange
it was
wine
the
out of
first
Oregon.
orange
So we
wine.
did that for 2004 and 2005. That didn't do that, but
They might have other questions, but
I know.
I have one. Yeah.
Well, what real quick, Jimmy and Cheryl and I and Bill and Deb, we used to walk that property because that was right next to the Hidden Springs vineyard that he was sourcing all his fruit from, and we used to talk about splitting that winery and growing it out and whatnot. And interestingly enough, when we left, Janie ended up leasing that same building for Brooks and sort of
And then
continuing
buying that
on
vineyard.
Yeah, and
Where
buying that vineyard.
where Brooks is now.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Small
The
world.
weekend before he taught Hadley how to change a tire. Flat tire.
So funny.
Yeah.
You know what's funny is we keep talking about Pinot Noir and talking about the Willamette Valley, whereas really our story is
Oregon. Yeah.
I mean, that's how we are different than most people. We have all these white
Well, there's a
wines
lot
and
more reasons we're different
we're a
than
lot
most people.
different. But I just find
That's
it
because
interesting. We haven't talked about
We
Oregon.
talked for
We
an
will.
hour and a
We're
half.
talking
We're
about
only into
the
first
origins,
quarter.
and that was Willamette Valley.
Well,
Our origins were a whole,
Yeah.
100%.
Origins are.
Yeah, to jump off on that, I just got back I was down in Medford last night and the Rogue and whatnot. And we're probably, and I say this without a huge amount of ego involved, but we're certainly number one, the largest purchaser of grapes down in Southern Oregon, and probably the real impetus, or what would, we spearheaded that region. We started buying grapes down there in 2001, and I think probably of any other region in Oregon the past couple of years, you've seen more development in that region, even more than the Willamette Valley. There's hundreds of acres going in the Umpqua and the Applegate and the Rogue, the Illinois Valley, really due to us. And that's been a really interesting journey. And I think, to tell, if we were to have hours to tell those stories, it's the story of all of our, who we call partners, but all of our growers and the growth of their vineyards. Don and Trouty Moore and Rob Wallace at Del Rio, and the new folks that are coming up from either different industries, like Hal Westbrook at Blue Heron Vineyard, who comes from a lumber background, is now probably one of the largest contiguous vineyards in Oregon, over 600 plus acres, or folks that are coming up from California, who are helping reinvigorate certainly the wine.
Eastern Oregon farmers
that are converting to grapes, or you have, and the other thing that's really fantastic to see over the years is those counties are really hurt. They were hurting, and they still are, because of the decrease in lumber sales. And there was lots of unemployment and lots of stagnation. And you see those economies now shifting from lumber-based economies to more vineyard-based economies, and it's really great. It's putting people to work. It's getting tourists to come in. It's getting money to flow into those economies again, and it's really
and marijuana.
Well, cannabis, yeah, but that's a whole other issue.
Sam's being too humble. On our behalf, he was seminal in the development of grape growing down there, and was committed from the get-go in 2003 to having all of the vineyards try to be certified sustainable within 3 years of working with us. We always provided a viticulturist for that. And money. We held seminars to teach the paperwork. We have paid for some vineyards who were compliant to be certified. And today we have 2 viticulturists on our staff to work with all these vineyards. But really, Sam's efforts down there, he was a champion early on. He saw the potential. He's worked with them. He's spent so many hours there. I really honestly believe that A to Z, because of Sam primarily, has made a difference in viticulture in Oregon.
Well, thank you, Deb. But it's been really it's been great to see the growth down there. It's really humbling and really cool. It's really cool.
And it's exciting in the gorge, and you're doing some of that same work there.
That's been exciting for us from our perspective, not in the industry, but documenting it, to see how much the regions have changed over the years, and in just the last 10 years, especially for Southern Oregon and out through the gorge, it's just been incredible, and reviving those communities.
Yeah.
I mean, when you go down, when we first started going down there was Don and Trouty and Randy Gold, Forrest, of course, and Del Rio was, I think planted in 88, 89. So it was brand spanking new. And now, they're thriving down there, which is really great. And it's interesting to see those changes here in the Willamette, of course. You see more and more vineyards, but then you get on a plane and I grew up in San Francisco, you fly down to Napa and you drive through Napa and you think, wow. I mean, you think we're seeing changes, or we're big, or, I mean, once again, when you go to a place like Napa, it reminds you that we're still small. I mean, we are still we may be mighty as an industry and on the world scene. I think Tom Danowski said, this is a pretty cool fact from the Oregon Wine Board, that in 2015, Oregon captured 1% of the domestic wine sales, right? Not import wine sales, but all domestic wine sold in the United States, 1%. I think if you include international or imports were
It
like
was
0.4
domestic.
or something like that. But I think if you include imports were like 0.4. But we were 20% of all 90 plus point wines as an industry, which is like amazing, right? I mean, it's really amazing. We make 4 million cases of wine here a year. California makes, I don't know what, 300 million. And so it's neat to see those changes. It's neat to see where we can go as well. And we talk about the pioneers and folks early, and we talk about, like, we've been here forever now, it feels like, but still this industry is only what, 50 years-ish old. We still got there's a long way to go. There's a lot of this story that hasn't been told yet.
You would have to be 50 for it to be 50-ish, almost 50.
Oh yeah, I'm almost 50. Thanks,
shit.
honey. Thank you.
Oh, you just
Sorry,
wait and see what's in
we.
store.
Well, I'd love to know, we talked to Paul Hart a few weeks ago and did an interview with him and got his story on how you guys got...
Can you play that for us?
Yeah.
Before we say that?
This is the trick question.
This is like your deposition. You're like, what did he say?
So we'd love to know from your perspective about finding out Rex Hill was available to be purchased, and how you went about deciding, and then how the transition took place.
That was really Sam who,
Me?
No.
Sam, we got to a point in 2006 where we were making wine at a large contract facility, and that wasn't working out. They wanted too much control over what was happening, and they didn't know what they were doing, so it was a bad cocktail. And we knew we had to finally own our own destiny. But, the sensible thing to do from a business standpoint would have been to go out into a cornfield and put up a tilt-up building and just run things through. Well, it's hard to get investors for tilt-up buildings in cornfields. They want something that has some panache to it. And so Rex Hill was on the market. I remember being out with two people who were on our board at the time at Higgins having lunch with Sam, and Sam brought it up, and I said, that's crazy. I said, we can't make A to Z in a winery like that. And, one of the other guys said, yeah, it is crazy, but it might not be that crazy. And then I came back and started thinking about it from the investment standpoint, and I thought, well, we could keep the core of this Rex Hill and then build it out. And it wasn't ideal. I mean, just if you look at how these buildings are shoehorned in here, we've spent $20-25 million on capital here. We would have spent 15 if we'd had a green site. So it's not, what? You think more than that?
I think we would have spent more than that in the long run if we were the size that we
It's just
are
the
now.
infrastructure of,
Yeah.
how hard, all
Yeah.
the dirt we've had to move and things like that is what I'm saying. But anyway, it would have been easier. And, and Cheryl's the one that been talking about how we built this thing because she's been the superintendent of it. But the other thing we faced was there was just nothing else available. We had to have a winery. So, Paul was ready, Paul and Jan were ready to retire and wanted to sell it. So, as it turned out, Deb and I went over to their house for dinner one night and talked about their artwork and their garden and their grandkids. And then at about 10:45 at night, we're sitting at the table. Paul said, so do you want to buy the winery? And we said, yeah. And he said, well, here's what I want for it. And we went, okay. And that whole thing took, about 20 minutes. And we drove back, drove back out to Dayton, and we passed here and said, well, guess we own this now. And So that, that was the purchase in a nutshell. But the best in all of it for me, and Amy would attest to it too, as Amy talks to Paul on a fairly regular basis. We still have some business connections, is that whenever you do something like this, and you buy a winery that is, at the time it was 20 years old, there are going to be things that go wrong. For instance, the first month when when we were doing the due diligence for thing, I looked and I said, boy, the utility costs are high here. And I thought, well, I'll just deal with that later, but it just jumped out at me. And then the first month after we had signed the papers and whatnot, our water bill, it's January. So you're not using any water in January, you're not doing anything. Our water bill comes from the city of Newburgh, because we're on Newburgh Water, and it's $10,400. Going, what? And what had been happening, the reason the utilities were so high,
We hydrate at A to Z.
The water main had been leaking, and then it burst. And when it burst, we were just flooding for a month, and fortunately the city of Newburgh was good about it, and we fixed it, and the next month it was $224.
Wow.
But it's stuff like that. Things happened, and there was, as we worked together there were vineyard leases that changed. There were ongoing business issues that had to be dealt with, and we were always able to sit down and amicably share the cost of what happened. It wasn't pointing fingers at, well, you did this. And what means very much to me is, it's like our culture means everything to me, is that 10 years later we have a warm relationship with Paul and Jan. And so often, I remember
Did Paul say the same thing?
I remember when we finished Domaine Drouin, we were walking through with the two architects. Robert and I were walking through, and Robert's going, "Oh, this is just marvelous." He said, "What do you do now?" He said, "In France," he said, "we would have a big party." And one of the architects said, "Now this is when we start suing each other." And it didn't happen. But in America, this is what happened. This was 30 years ago, so imagine what it's like now. And that never happened with us, that it was just, you always could work it out. So that Paul and Jan built this, they have their legacy. They didn't have to think of this in terms of, they're able to think of it that it was carried on by people who cared about it and who respected them, and it's been a wonderful transition. And
the other part of the transition, I think that may be missed in that, was that we were here making wine. They were somebody who we worked with for a few years prior to the transition. So actually that harvest of 2006, we were all parked in the office with the winemakers there, and we had already had a working relationship with people. So it was harvest, and we were here, and we had an intern, we had somebody working for us. We're in and out and in the offices and saying hi in the tasting room. So there was already that relationship. And then when that came up, it was like, bricks and mortar. Well, I guess we do need to transition. And this other relationship we had was sort of heading downhill, or wasn't working, and
Heading downhill.
wasn't the right match. And so we were here, and things were working well, and they continued to work better, and we could see how it might be the right choice for us. And I feel like I spent a lot of time that vintage 2006 on the phone with you, Bill. I remember walking through vineyards, and we're like, well, if we put up a building, how much could we do? What could we do? And all of, the iterations of
Does it work? You know, what do we know about the facility? What do we know about the site? Long term, what if we took an empty piece of land? Well, this is what's available to us, and would it work for a few years? And Paul was naturally transitioning out, and I don't think his kids were interested in the business, and you know, so it was sort of this seamless, a seamless integration. We thought, I mean, we learned a lot after January 1st, once we actually had the winery and January 1st hit, and we, you know, looked at our bills and tried to figure out who was going to be in what office and who reports to whom, and wow, wait, where's my desk going to be? I mean, there was a lot, but that transition of harvest, it seemed really easy. We're, oh yeah, we'll do this. And
A to Z was 7 people because we did everything, we outsourced everything. And now we suddenly had 57 people. And
Plus tanks, plus vineyards.
And
plus,
57 SKUs. And we're like, Deb, you have that handled, right? Is that okay? You have your head around it. So I think it was obviously a huge transition, but
it was a goal.
We got into it, you know, blind, which was beautiful because maybe we wouldn't have.
Bill said with 57 people, we need to have HR, and he looks around, Charlotte, that will be you. To my embarrassment, I didn't know what it meant, but I learned it means homeroom. I'm sent there a lot, but we did inherit a brand that was one of the legacy brands of Oregon, to be sure, but it kind of lost its way a bit. Paul had difficulty with his knee with operation somewhere around 2000, 2001. And after that, it seemed there was a little rudderless. And what we inherited, they had relinquished the Willamette Valley appellation for Oregon. I thought that was a mistake for one of the legacy wineries. I thought that should be all about place. So we reclaimed 100% Willamette Valley for Rex Hill Wines. We bought about a 39,000+ case winery. All of those wines sold for more than A to Z. But we eliminated the white program immediately. We didn't think the quality was to our standards. And we reduced the size of Rex Hill down to 16,000 the first year and down to 8,000 the second year. So we reduced the size 77% of a winery we'd bought that was much bigger. It was a dangerous and probably foolish economic decision, but it was the right thing to do for the brand and for quality. We had, there were about 29 SKUs listed in all of their materials, and we felt focus would be a better idea, so we reduced that down to 6 initially. It's a little bit more than that now. We had wine club members who had verticals of many years of certain of these mini single vineyards, and we said, well, we're going to do it differently. We're going to do it blind and by merit only, and only have a few, so that our Willamette Valley blend can be more complex. We're blenders, we believe in that. We began to farm everything biodynamically using those principles. Michael Davies, our winemaker, and Sam and Cheryl and I had all been in the initial original biodynamic study group in Oregon. It was not popular then. It was looked at as sort of voodoo, and people mocked us and put gnomes on our front porches, that kind of thing. But we began to farm that way. Sam was very committed to that idea from the get-go. So we made these big changes right from the get-go, but all for the quality of the brand and the legacy. And these 50 people who became our employees and were a little bit nervous about that upstart, low cost, high quality, A to Z taking over, and oh my, what will happen to Rex Hill? We kept the brands completely separate for the first couple years, and even to this day, a lot of people don't recognize that although Rex Hill is less than 2% of what we do today, it is truly the creme de la creme. I don't know another property that could possibly have the selection of vineyards that we have. We have more Oregon winemaking experience than any other other winery in the world. And so that pulling off What we want to build from the top is a true commitment to quality and the legacy.
And you said something that was very important about who we are and how we do things. And they said, well, maybe that wasn't the best financial decision.
That's who we are.
Well,
Can you erase that on the tape?
we have not.
He's the one with the MBA.
But it's and we had a board of finance people, and 6 years ago, we ended up in World War VI, and they're not here anymore. And in fact, we control Sam, but we have 3 people on our board, and Sam and I are 2 of them. But what we were able to, what we essentially went to war over was that we're going to make strategic decisions at A to Z. We're going to figure out what's the right strategy. It might cost us more in the short run. It might not be the best financial decision in the short run, but in the long run, it's going to be the best thing to grow the company in a healthy way. And so with Rex Hill, short term, was that the best thing? Long term, it was far and away the best thing to do.
But we're a company that's about brand, and that's not typical. We're probably about the 50th largest or best-selling company in winery in the United States of domestic wineries today. But we're not really about pushing boxes. It's not. We don't think that way. We don't even call our wine a product. We call it wine. It takes a whole year to make that, and we do it with care and love. So one of the important things for us is that we are a brand that represents the highest quality wine for the greatest sustainable value. But we have an equal second goal, which is to be to achieve that while we build a company that's a force for good. So we became the only certified B Corp winery in the world 2 years ago. We've helped others since then and advised companies that aren't wineries to do that. But the B Corp was the first certification that began to codify our principles that we tried to employ since we started the company, which is to model best practices and be a force for good. So we had to change the legal language in our documents that we're not a corporation, we're an LLC, but many corporations, maybe all, I don't know, have legal language that says that they will make the most profit for shareholders. We don't have that language. Our language today is that we will take into account all of our stakeholders and that we will commit to trying to be a force for good in terms of the environment, the community, of course our own staff, and that will be economically sustainable. You can do all the good in the world for 2 years and you're out of business. That's not sustainable. So I think it's those two things. We're brand driven. That's not typical. And we value what we're building as a company as much as what we're doing with love, with making the highest quality wine for the greatest sustainable value. And I think that if the 4 of us had been making rivets or sweaters, we would have still had those 2 goals.
Yeah, that goes back to when you asked me the question about, so what was it about wine? I say all the time, if you gave me the choice between being the CEO of a wine company with a bad culture or a bolt company with a great culture, I'd rather have the bolt company. It's really nice to have a wine company with a great culture, but the culture is what really motivates me.
I want to go back a little bit to the transition because it sounded a little bit easier than it actually was. That first year was pretty tough. You know, we went from, having 3 employees in a rented office and 4 computers and a printer, and being really profitable and really successful and
going out to dinner
and
we went to San Francisco.
It wasn't easy, but certainly with the acquisition of Rex Hill, it brought a whole new slate of challenges that in some ways we might not in some ways, certainly, we were certainly up to the challenges in some ways, but some were it was quite the challenge for us. I personally remember 2007, Cheryl was very pregnant with our third child, Stella, and trucks were rolling in, and then happened to coincide with a downturn in the housing market. And the skies opened up, and we had 7.5 inches of rain that harvest in the middle of vintage. And I just remember sitting on a bin at 2 a.m, and the rain's pouring down, and just exhausted and thinking, why did we do this? Just thinking it was the wrong decision. But we, at that time, I don't know, I was out for a moment. I don't know if you'd spoken about this, but we hired someone, Amy Prosenjack, who's now our president, and she was able, certainly not single-handedly, but to really fill those gaps where we fell short. And without the 4 of us, we certainly couldn't be where we are now. We couldn't have gotten at least to the place to acquire Rex Hill. But from that time on, without the 5 of us, I think so. I really think some of those obstacles would have been insurmountable with just the 4 of us. But with the addition of Amy, it really spurred us on to new heights, and to really make that leap into a real company, and a company which continues to grow, not only in sales and production, but continues to grow in culture as well.
It's funny not to have her in here.
Yeah, there's no question. She built the systems for the company. She has mentored people, and she's been crucial to our success. She joined us 2 weeks after we bought Rex Hill.
Those years were tough.
Those years took a lot of years off of me. I know it was the hardest thing I've ever done. If anybody said to me, would you start another company or turn one around? I'm too old to do either, but it would absolutely be start another company, because it's your own vision. It takes time to re-envision something that is what you want it to be and what you believe in and think is the highest quality, while maintaining its history. My marriage didn't survive after 41 years. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done, when personally, and I know for everybody in different ways, we doubled our distribution almost overnight. That ought to all be sorted out. There were so many things that were completely challenging, redoing the packaging, rethinking how the size and positioning, and I was on the road an awful lot. It was very difficult.
When we first started the company, we had 2 tanks of wine that a forklift could have hit, and it would have been done at that point. Those years, as Deb was saying, that 2008, 2009, we sort of came out of it. I think in 2009, were probably, Deb and Cheryl and I went to go hear Phil Knight speak the other day, and he was, just released this book called Shoe Dog, and was speaking up in Portland, and I was struck by, this company's a $40 billion a year in sales company, but the parallels to some of the challenges that he had in bringing the company and the origins and whatnot, it really, those years, were the most threatening to not only to us as a partnership, but to the company. And every, I think a lot of companies go through that, and the test of the company is, can they make it out of those years? And we were fortunate enough, with the help of all 5 of us, to make it out of that patch, and to be where we are today. I was talking to the CEO of Stumptown the other day, and he said 3% of all beverage companies make it to above 10 million in sales. Now, those are really, really, really small odds. And then it gets worse. It gets smaller and smaller from that 10 million on up. And I just feel gratitude and feel so privileged to have been a part of this. Been a part of this journey.
Those difficult times lasted. They were different for all of us,
right,
but they lasted really through 2011.
Yeah.
Time we had the sales force in place.
It's pretty amazing when we look back, and I during this conversation I kept thinking, well, what are those milestones, or how did we know what we were doing? You know, and I don't know. I'd have to really think about that. You know, were we going from one thing to one thing or whatnot? And I think to Deb said, you know, it's that chase of the excellence or the pursuit of our potential that we've never, and that culture of innovation and creativity, we've never let go of that from case, you know, 2,500 case start to, you know, 375,000 case production last year, and it's been quite a journey, and a lot of bumps and bruises along the way too, but a lot of good things have come out of it as well.
Well, and I think we all have different strengths on how we get from one milestone to the other. Some of us, I mean, the four of us and Amy included in that, some of us are good at throwing the dart out and saying we need to be there, and other ones are good at trying to figure out how to fill in between where we are to that next line in the sand. So I think we all look at milestones different, some with a little more granular resolution and others with larger swaths. So yeah, I think that's one of those things you ask any one of us and you're going to see a big difference in granularity in how we see what a milestone
Maybe what would be a way to say it is that our competitive drive is internal. How can we all, and as a company, get better, rather than as opposed to others out there, different people, different brands, different companies. We're driven to be the best within each of us and together.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of work. That doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
I think it's a milestone. I just get up every day. But
And
Again, you just wait.
I even mean within our group, we see how milestones are. We see them differently.
Definitely, that's been a great asset.
That's been a huge asset.
As long as you can hear one another, and that's not always easy. We had to work on that.
What?
So you got a question? Sorry, I know.
I don't buy green bananas anymore, Sam.
Yeah.
We have a limited time.
Leads really well into what are your goals for A to Z in the future? Where do you think it's going? And then our last question is, where do you think Oregon's going? So it's easier for you to answer both those questions in one, however you want to answer it.
No, I'm coughing.
And we can do that in 10 minutes.
Yeah. Like Sam says, waking up in the morning is a goal, right? No, I mean,
It's a milestone.
it's a milestone. Why doesn't somebody else
in a
go
global
first?
perspective, one of the things is by becoming the biggest, although that wasn't the goal in Oregon, or the best-selling Oregon brand, however you want to cut it, production or sales, our competitive set, our group, our colleagues now become other people in the world, not necessarily Oregon. What is it, some 80% of Oregon wineries make less than 5,000 cases. You know, we hope to model best practices and lead by example. We want to do good. But in terms of our business for A to Z, really, we're in a different subset now. So I hope that we inspire Oregonians, Oregon wineries, but even more than that, businesses. And I hope that's around the world. The second winery to certify after us was an Argentinian one. So it gives us an opportunity to inspire others, not just wineries, not just Oregon wineries, not just Oregonians. And for me, that's exciting.
I think it's hard to capture that question because it depends on the time. Had you asked me that 3 or 4 years ago, it was a different answer. You know, I grew up in California, grew up in the wine industry a little bit in California, working at wine stores, and for me, that a while ago, I wanted, you know, my feeling was to be the Robert Mondavi or the Mondavi winery of Oregon in the heyday of Mondavi. You know, since had some issues, because for me, Mondavi was it was California wine. That's, you know. And I think my goal is infinitely more simple yet infinitely more complex as well now, is I just want to be the best company that we can be, and not there may be an end point, there may be a case quantity, it may be whatever, a tipping point where that happens or it doesn't happen. But that's what drives me every day when I get up how can we be the best company, no longer the best winery, how can we be the best company that we can be? And that for me extends out to everything we do, whether it's from farming a grape to putting wine in a bottle to selling wine to interacting with the community to working with our employees. It's for me gone beyond it'd be great to be. So anyway, more simple yet way more complex as well.
And I couldn't say that any better. I agree completely with that.
Yeah, we're not.
The rest of it takes care of itself. If you do that right, everything else happens the way it's supposed to.
It's easy to cut corners and it's easy to do the easiest option. Obviously.
And that comes back to choosing finance over strategy. If you stay with your cultural values, your ethical values, strategic values, the money takes care of itself. But as soon as you start cutting corners and you make financial decisions, you're starting to act out of fear. Yeah. And that's going to limit what you're going to do.
And if we chase our potential and become the best company that we can be, which I think there is still lots of room for improvement, we will become iconic. We will become the Mondavi of Oregon. We'll become the A to Z of Oregon.
As for Oregon, I think Oregon's at a crossroads, and it has been many times in its short little history for Oregon wines. We have an almost unique opportunity for a young region to be considered world-class and to consistently offer superior wines. We have some special things about where we are and what we found to grow here that isn't always communicated equally around the world and in the country. And with so many players, many of whom came like I did with grapes in their eyes but no real knowledge of what they were doing, we have the danger of undercutting that and we've had these big harvests in a row, and we have the risk of having Oregon wine just become another thing, another wine region. We're so different from California and Washington, and that story isn't communicated. So most of what I've done in crafting the story of A to Z and telling it around the world is about Oregon. It isn't about our company. It's about the grape varieties, or it's about Oregon. And I think we still have the opportunity to capture that spot, but I think it's in danger.
I think more speaking from a financial perspective, I think that the risk to the industry now is that we have too many wineries. We had 200 wineries at the end of 2004, and now we have 700. And people talk about the growth of the Oregon wine industry. It's the growth of wineries. It's not the growth of market that's keeping up with it. And, in your interviews, you may have already encountered this, but people who have, I'll use, lack of a better word, iconic labels, marquee labels in the state, will say that their sales are falling off because it's a 3,000 case winery that has a great reputation, long history, and somebody builds a $20 million winery down the road, and you say, oh, this weekend, let's go see that new winery. Well, you go there and you buy one, you didn't buy it from here. There's not enough people coming in here. We do a very poor job in industry marketing, but the market's not growing fast enough. Over 40% of the wine produced in Oregon sold in Oregon, and the pie is just, there are just too many people, trying to carve up a pie that isn't getting sufficiently bigger. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's a problem.
I think the influx of some of the larger players can be a very good thing for Oregon, but what I've noticed in a number of instances is they're not as collaborative as our our industry has been historically, and that's a very unusual thing for the history of winemaking in the world. That collaboration has served us very well, and so that part makes me sad to see that they're all going to go their own way and whatever. I'm not a fan of that. I think it's remarkable that Oregon has probably uniquely collaborated across industry so that wine, beer, and spirits are working together with the Oregon Craft Beverage Council. That I don't know anywhere else where you get those three entities collaborating. So my hope is with the bigger players that if they will work together at all, I think it will help us accelerate the security and the growth of the column of Oregon wines, so that no one can have a list anywhere in a good restaurant in the world without representing Oregon wines too. Their resources should help that effort, but it's nice when they're a little bit more
But what
collaborative.
militates against that is that they're corporate cultures. Corporate cultures are corporate cultures.
Any last thoughts from Sam and Cheryl?
Well, I'm going to be sort of the naysayer. I think we've got glory days ahead for the Oregon wine industry. I mean, so we, A to Z founded a group called the Oregon Food and Beverage Leadership Council that we gathered together some of the who we consider the top brand names of branded food and beverage in Oregon. Stumptown, Tillamook, Dave's Killer Bread, Bob's Red Mill, Full Sail. I mean, the list goes on. And I think what we're seeing is, to Deb's point, is this cross-industry collaboration that I think is tremendous. If you look at the jobs in Oregon, there are more people employed in the alcohol industry here in Oregon, in the production of alcohol industry, than there are in the software industry here in Oregon. We talk about the tech sector. Let's start focusing on the alcohol sector. If you look at food and beverage jobs, we had food and beverage job growth in Oregon during the recession. All other industries went down. We were the only state in the United States to have growth in the food and beverage sector during the recession. All other states were flat or down. So we've got this amazing culture going on in Oregon that really crosses over these different lines. We're still small enough that we can join hands across these industries. So the future's ahead of us. What, to Bill's point perhaps, is we need to figure out how we grab that and to Deb's point, how we tell that story to the rest of the world, because I can guarantee you there are other wine regions out there, there are other states that want to take away Oregon's advantage. Oregon has had a tremendously long history of diversified, higher quality agricultural food and beverage, but the way that has looked has changed dramatically in the past 20 years, and wine is part of that, a big chunk of it, but still only a part. So if we can continue these collaborations, join hands across industry, work with state government, and be able to solidify our leadership, not only in the United States, but really in the world, I think there's tremendous opportunity ahead of us, and I'm excited for it. It really, though, once again, to Deb's point, we are at a pivot point, and we need to press on the gas, and we need to accelerate it, and we need to figure out what makes Oregon so special and be able to figure out the best way to tell that story. And if we fail in doing that, we're going to become just another wine region.
You just heard why he's known as Senator Sammer.
Yeah.
But software wages are sustainable. I mean, you can sustain a family and...
No. So
wine production...
You look at the numbers,
wages.
Bill, they're absolutely median wages in Oregon. Yeah, absolutely median wages in the food and beverage industry in Oregon. So they're great jobs. They're growing. They revitalize rural areas. They keep the whole state healthy, not just urban areas. And that's where the wine, it takes one person to farm 10 acres in a vineyard. And one job in a rural county is equal to something like 125 jobs in an urban county. So if we can keep planting vineyards, keep employing people, those rural counties are going to prosper and they're going to survive. And they're a really important part of Oregon. They're an important part of our business for sure.
And you have to
Well,
develop a market to sell, make the wine, to sell the wine.
But back to
from the
your
vineyard.
point, Bill,
That's
if I only see it, you said very similar things to what I was going to say, which is, back to your
married.
point, if we're selling 40% of our wines in state, I just see that as opportunity. I mean, there's tons of opportunity for Oregon right now, and with bigger companies coming in, yes, we have the downside, but it's something we haven't seen before. And again, I think it's opportunity for us to lift our game and market Oregon in a better way. People are more organized. And as it relates to A to Z, we're not on a big growth curve right now. I mean, we're in a good place. We're just going deeper and better. And I think it bodes well for where we are in the industry with new people coming in and new alliances and a little bit of a refreshed pool of people. And I think that's all good stuff. There's tons of opportunity out there, stuff that we haven't even touched on in the years that we've been in business. I mean, just a little bit. And I think with these partnerships you've been working on and forging in food and beverage, I think it's only getting better in those.
We do have one big challenge coming up, and that's global warming. I think in the short term that's going to be a boom for the wine industry here. But in the long term, we will not only have to face some serious adaptation here, because most of the food and beverage, we're really climate dependent, food and beverage in Oregon. But it's also instigating, climate change migration with folks coming up into Oregon. What's the landscape going to look like when something like 70% of our private lands are going to change hands, private ag lands are going to change hands over the next 20 years? What does that look like 20 years from now? What do we look like 50 years from now? And we've got to get Oregon's so small, we're not going to be able to do anything really to affect global climate change. So what we need to look at is how do we influence other areas to do things, or how do we find ways to adapt to a future that is not only coming, it's here. We're a week earlier than last year. Last year was the warmest year. We're going into this weekend, and it's going to be tomorrow, 95, 98 degrees. I mean, it's going to blow away the record that was in 2003, which was a hot year here.
But it's also going to be 70 by next Wednesday.
But we're a week ahead of where we were last year, which was the earliest year.
Which is huge.
When you have California picking in the end of July, that's not
craziness.
And 1 out of every 4 California wines getting alcohol taken out mechanically, that's just not sustainable.
It's not just temperature, it's water. There'll probably be wars over water. And so, Oregon sits, we're sitting well right now, but it's ever present in my mind about the environment.
Yeah, that's going to be the biggest challenge that our industry will face. Forget about markets, forget about whatever. That'll be the biggest challenge I think that we'll face.
Water.
Just climate change and water.
Right.
Because we don't use a lot of water. Wineries can recycle, vineyards can be farmed without water, but water will drive people to come into Oregon.
Yeah,
that's what I meant.
Well, I know we've reached our time with you and then some, so thank you guys so